Even though they were 60 feet from the waterline, the spray came down like rain on the top of the car. The ground and the floor of the van shook as the massive shape thundered towards them. A scaly jaw too massive to be believed, wide open, full of crooked, hooked teeth. And then came the impact, sand flying, metal crunching. Miria could feel parts of the suspension buckling under the force. The squid's bag breached and sent a surge of salt water across the floor. The massive creature reared back in the headlights, an eye on the side of its head flashing red in a sudden glare. Miria could make out the shape of a crocodile, so massive she couldn't take it all in. A terrible echo of Tiamat's fury. Then it slammed into the Econoline again. A massive clawed foot came down on the hood, denting it, sending cracks spidering across the glass. Edryk let out a scream of terror as he gripped desperately to the roof rack. Then there was a third collision. The van skidded up the beach, leaving deep furrows in the sand. Flakes of old black paint came away in Edryk's hands. His arms windmilled for a moment, and then he hit the sand.
Edryk, get out of there!
Welcome to Swords Against Madness, an experiment in gonzo storytelling and solo role-playing. I'm playing a solo game of Swords and Wizardry, amplified by other classic role-playing games like Traveller, and accompanied by solo role-playing tools like the Mythic Game Master emulator. First I play the game, then I turn it into a psychedelic sword and planet audio drama for your entertainment. Swords and Wizardry is based on the original 1974 through 1977 rules to Dungeons & Dragons. It is trippy, fast-paced, and lethal, just the way I like it. There will be no protection for player characters when the dice decide that their number is up. But I do keep this story PG, or at least what passed for PG in the 1980s. If you didn't see it in Temple of Doom, Goonies, or Gremlins, you won't hear about it here. So reload that three-bladed sword. Get comfortable in your studded leather kirtle or your chainmail bikini. Fire up the wizard band. It's time to get weird. I'm really not going to make any bones about it. My party is in over their heads, and I like it that way. I've made practically no effort to balance the encounter tables. Because once you're off the material plane, you're into dimensions where the gods tread. It should feel strange and dangerous and over the top. For those of you who haven't read the Enuma Elish, I'm borrowing from the Babylonian creation myth here. In the Enuma Elish, the universe starts as chaos, an infinite sea of turgid salt water, from which a creature arises, Tiamat, the great dragon. Eventually, a divine male principle, Abzu, came to her and mated with her, creating the gods. But the gods craved order where Abzu and Tiamat were chaos. And eventually that rebellion led to Abzu being destroyed. In revenge for the death of her lover, Tiamat birthed a legion of monsters. Dragons, giants, man-scorpions, crocodiles. And eventually the gods had to turn upon her and slay her too. The chief of the gods, Marduk, made the heavens out of Abzu, and the world out of the flesh of Tiamat. All of which I was very proud of myself for remembering from my 1999 course on ancient mythology with Dr. Ivan Cohen, who I very much doubt is listening. When I decided I wanted to create a massive planar journey, I went to one of the places where I always got inspiration for D&D as a kid, my dad's record collection. The idea for a primordial plane of chaotic waters came from the album covers to the first two Asia albums, which were painted by Roger Dean, one of my favorite psychedelic 70s fantasy artists. I'll see if I can't put a copy of my favorite in the show notes, with proper crediting, of course. While looking at some of those amazing old Roger Dean album covers, I got the idea of a place where a dragon lies dead across a shallow sea, and to get where you're going you have to wander across her vast scaly coils. It was a pretty quick jump to imagine that dragon is not the D&D version of Tiamat, but the Babylonian Tiamat in all of her terrifying glory. Which also means I saw fit to create an encounter table that had all of her warrior children. And so the table includes drakes, dragons, giants, man-scorpions, and of course crocodiles. I'm not interested in game balance. I'm interested in creating an interesting game. And so, of course, I threw saltwater crocodiles on the list. I made a note to use just whatever was put in the AD&D 2nd edition Monstrous manual. And was absolutely horrified when the dice said I would be facing 2 to 12 saltwater crocodiles. Lucky for me, most of them failed their morale check when Miria turned on the lights and honked the horn. But not all of them, leaving my party to face down 1,000 kilograms of angry reptile. Neither party was surprised, and the crocodile attacked the van with a force and vengeance that I could hardly believe as the dice fell. The van got knocked down to 60% of its hit points, and Edryk, who I ruled was scouting from the doorway of the van, had to make a save versus wands or be pitched out onto the ground. But I've teased this out enough. Let's get back to the nightmare.
Edryk, get out of there!
It's time for battle!
Miria's fingers seemed to turn to jelly as she fumbled for the laser in her belt.
Come on.
It took her a moment to get the electro-laser pistol out and activated, all the while watching as the massive reptile stepped closer and closer to her fallen companion. She kicked open the door with her foot, took aim, and pulled the trigger. The laser screamed as she held the trigger as long as she could, feeling the device heat up in her hands. Calling on a dirty pirate trick she had learned in her days with Atrocity, she twisted the knob on the side of the laser meant to control the intensity, confusing the failsafe so that she could keep the energy flowing. She carved a jagged, blistered rent from the crocodile's snout up its face, just over top of one of its eyes and down to its neck. The stench of cooking reptile joined the smells of salt and decay. Kale grabbed hold of the squid and tossed it into the back of the van so they could plant a foot firmly in the puddle where its bag had been. He raised the crossbow, took careful aim, and put a bolt into the creature's eye socket. The crocodile thrashed and roared with rage, kicking up sand and rocking the van. While in a half-panic, Edryk scrambled backwards across the sand, pulling out throwing daggers and tossing them carelessly at the creature, hoping to scare it off. One sank deep into a scale on the front of the creature's face, but it hardly noticed as it thrashed from the pain of the laser blast and the crossbow bolt. His ears were ringing, his heart was hammering. Edryk couldn't hear anything over the sound of his own fear as he pulled himself up to a standing position against the van, his knees threatening to give out. Round 1 ends with the crocodile at a mere 9 of its 22 hit points, but with Edryk exposed, and another nasty surprise for Miria. There was a pop and a hiss in Miria's hand as the battery finally gave out. Screaming a curse of frustration, she cast round and put her fingers on the Arakeen bottle that hung from her belt. Desperately, she unstoppered it and called the command for as much salt water as she could muster, blasting the creature hard across the face with the force of a fire hose. She swept the jet of water at the creature's wounded eye, at the cuts she'd just rent in her tissue, hoping against hope she could distract it long enough for Edryk to get clear. The beast turned and snapped once, twice at the jet of water, but the moment Edryk shuffled, it turned its head to face easier prey. Kale reached back to where he kept his bolt case hanging from one of the garment hooks. He tried to keep his hands from shaking as he loaded his bow. The moment Miria gave him an opening, he aimed and fired with his crossbow. A quarter inch to the left, it would have sunk into the burnt flesh, but as it was, the bolt bounced harmlessly off the creature's scales and off into the grass. Time slowed down for Edryk. His eyes flicked around, looking for some place that would be safe. There was no way to get behind the van. It would take too long. He couldn't get into it. The scale hut? A stiff breeze looked like it could knock it down. The grasses. He might be able to hide somewhere in the grass bank. He turned and launched himself, running faster than he ever had before in his life. A cold, wet breeze carrying a carrion stench washed over his back, and the feeble lights for the van were blotted out. And then the jaw clamped around his middle. Edryk let out a pained gasp as teeth sunk deep into his flesh, and then he was pulled up into the air. For a moment he dangled, looking down at the massive jaws of the crocodile, and then they snapped around his middle, enveloping his feet and the creature's massive gullet. Terror and adrenaline suddenly making the world very bright. He turned and could see the horrified expression on Miria's face. As the jaw snapped open and closed again, teeth digging into his chest. And then the beast began to roll. The world was a blur of flying sand, scales, and stench, before consciousness left him. Miria and Kale were knocked back into their seats by the shockwave as the creature threw itself down on the stand and rolled. They were forced at least momentarily to shield their eyes from the flying grit. By the time the sand had stopped flying and Edryk had stopped screaming, it was already too late. They watched as the massive crocodile backed into the water and was gone, leaving behind it deep, shining red furrows in the sand.
Do you like your tabletop RPGs to be grim, gritty, and grounded? If so, then Legend of the Bones is the podcast for you. A hybrid of dark fantasy audio drama and old-school solo D&D. In Legend of the Bones, the dice rule. There'll be no rerolls, no fudging the dice, no metacurrency. The roll of the bones will determine the character's destiny, and no one will be spared their fate. None shall escape the destiny of Bone.
That was absolutely brutal. When I set up camp, I randomly assigned the seating. I figured the back of the van would be desirable, but somebody would need to be in the front just in case of emergencies. And I ruled that when I rolled a random encounter, it would be whoever was in the back seat who would get halfway out of the van and have a look around. This put Edryk in possibly the most dangerous position in the group. Because when I rolled saltwater crocodiles, he was the one who was going to be hanging half in, half out of the van. On the surprise round, I had the crocodile attack the van itself, and it did a whopping 19 damage on the first blow. When in doubt when playing an OSR game, if somebody has a chance of being knocked over or otherwise put in a serious risk, I generally just go with a saving throw. If you're playing something like AD&D, save versus death rate is a great way to determine whether or not somebody just got knocked on their butt. Of course, in Swords and Wizardry, there's only one saving throw. And when the crocodile hit the van, sadly Edryk failed his, being thrown free. Suddenly, he was the only valid target. Miria and Kale made one hell of a show of whittling down the crocodile's hit points. But the darn thing just would not fail a morale save. I wanted to give Edryk every chance in the world. So when the party won initiative on that third round, I had Miria hose it down with the decanter of endless water. I figured, well, 1,000-kilogram, 6-meter-long crocodile probably can't be knocked down with a fire hose blast of water. It should probably make a saving throw or at least be forced to turn or back up a little bit. And maybe, just maybe, it should also make a morale test given the strange, unexpected effect. The dice definitely had different ideas. The crocodile passed its saving throw with a natural 19. And I rolled snake eyes on my 2d6 morale check. No, this crocodile was going after Edryk whether I liked it or not. The rules in this situation are simple. Edryk can make a run for it, but the creature gets one automatic attack. Given how much he's being harried and harassed by things like blasts of water, it was at a -4. But Edryk isn't exactly wearing armor. In true D&D fashion, just for good measure, I rolled a natural 20 on the attack roll against Edryk, meaning he ended up taking a whopping 37 damage, over 3 times his maximum hit points. And as much as I desperately wanted to save him, this is a game of D&D, and there's no point in playing if you're not going to let the dice fall where they may. At least in this case, it's still a crocodile, and it's going to act like a crocodile. It's not going to turn on the rest of the party or total the van. It's going to take its prize and dive deep underwater with it. So the rest of the party is, for the time being, safe. But that still leaves us in a major inflection point of the story. Where do we go from here? Do we keep facing the perils of the plains, even as they keep getting bigger and more dangerous? Do we cut and run? Miria's lost so many people since she's come to Nar. She deeply admired Olan and was developing feelings for him. Rhea had become like a sister to her. She had deeply respected Nala, even if she found her strange. While she had played head games with Raxon, she respected why he was there and was glad for his help. But Edryk had become as close as she's got to a best friend on this island. And while you can play characters pretty cold in D&D because life is so cheap, you have to stop and ask yourself, as a good role player, what does all this death mean to the player character? How do they approach understanding that everything they do may well be a matter of life and death? How does it shake them when they lose a party member? And what would they do to make things different? There was nothing to signal the all clear. No real way to be sure that more crocodiles weren't coming, but there was something in the air that said that this was final, that the immediate, vicious physical danger was done, and now they had no choice but to face the other peril. Miria stepped numbly out of the van. She wasn't aware of how bad she was shaking. She couldn't hear how ragged her own breath had become. Her steps along the path of red compacted sand and churned rock were slow, almost aimless. She let out a long, slow breath, uneven, jagged. The water vapor that escaped her lips swirled in a cloud for a moment and was gone in the strange, stinking sea breeze. And then she hunched down on the sand, wrapped her arms around her knees, and stared at the blotch of disturbed, foamy water where the crocodile had vanished with Edryk in its maw. The cold, the damp, the wind, none of those touched her. Her mind was an EVA suit all its own, a shell of comforting numbness, armor against a torrent of tears that threatened to let themselves loose if she dared to feel. She was only vaguely aware of Kale walking up next to her and placing a hand on her shoulder. His words seemed to be coming to her from 1,000 parsecs away. Miria? Miria, are you okay? No, you're not okay. Kale's own mind drifted unpleasantly to the horrors that happened at Giscani. How important it was to let himself be numb for a while, when the islanders there had presented him with the heads of half of his crew. He pushed down the ugly memory. No, you're not okay at all. Look, I'm gonna move the wagon further up into the grass. We might be a little safer there until we can figure out what to do next. I know you need to check out right now. It's fine. Sometimes you just have to take a break. But I want you to be safe. When I call for you, I need you to come up, okay? Kale hovered, helpless to figure out what else to do, until Miria finally nodded and indicated she'd heard what he'd said. She didn't want to shut him out. She didn't really want to be alone, but she just couldn't engage right now. It was comforting to hear him fiddling with the keys, to start the engine and slowly roll the van up the hill into the tall grasses. At least she knew she wasn't alone. Well, not yet. There was also a subtle stirring in her mind. Was she ever really alone? What did the all-knowing think of this? How does a being from beyond space and time as she understood it process grief and trauma? Can it even experience such things? But she shut that down. This wasn't the time to go talking to the all-knowing. This was the time for Miria to handle Miria problems. And appealing as it was, sitting on this beach waiting to be eaten was not an option. She blew out one more cloudy breath, and then shakily got herself to her feet, and followed the tracks up to where the Econoline now sat partially concealed on the grass at the crest of the dune. The subtle scent of pipe tobacco greeted her nose as she approached, mercifully blotting out the smell of rotting sargassum and the not quite decayed but definitely dead stench of Tiamat. Edryk was using the Arakeen bottle to refill the oilskin now that he had rescued the squid from where he had been left wallowing in a puddle in the rear of the van. Miria gently held out her hand, and Kale, understanding the near-universal gesture, handed over his pipe. Miria took a long pull on it and immediately began to hack and cough. Oh, easy there. That's a twist of amphora. It's strong stuff. You know, I know you're nearly 200 years old and all, but somehow I can't picture you as enjoying this. He gently retrieved his pipe from her fingers.
It's been a while. My grandfather, he used to smoke it. It used to aggravate my mother to no end every time he smoked around us. But he was daimyo. He could get away with whatever he wanted.
You sound like you really admired him, and that you miss him.
He was the ruler of an entire world. He could have anything he wanted. Buy entire planets. He had the means if he wanted to. But he used to tell me that wealth and power were only good for two things: protecting the people you love and spoiling your grandchildren.
He sounds like he must have been a great man.
I thought so. I've been thinking about him a lot lately.
How did you lose him?
He was publicly beheaded when I was still a little girl. Show trials and succession politics, you know.
Edryk nodded his head slowly. Although, to be honest, he had no idea how those things went. He had never been very close to any kind of power except money, the kind that had been hard-earned. But he could imagine the kind of pain that would come from having to watch someone you love beheaded over something as foolish as status and power. He took a long pull on his pipe, deciding it better to let silence speak for him. They sat there, quiet, wordless, simply glad not to be alone in a place like that on the sill of the van door, until a gentle prodding touched the edge of Miria's mind.
You seem upset, but it's only the start of the Great Migration.
The squid's thoughts came with a warming, comforting sensation that she hardly expected from the being.
Great Migration. I hardly expected to hear religion from a squid.
Not religion, just an understanding of how the universe works.
My grandfather used to say the same thing about Buddhism. That it wasn't a religion so much as understanding the way the universe worked. Why do you call it the Great Migration?
When my kind dies, we can still sense their mind. We understand that this is just a new stage of life. New stages means new migrations. We understand that we cannot follow until we join them in their stage of life. Just like when I was a hatchling, I couldn't cross the sea.
I mean, that's very beautiful in its way. But it's mostly just a metaphor for death, right? I mean, nobody knows what happens after we die, or even if the consciousness survives.
A feeling like a wave of pity washed over her from the squid. Despite its childlike nature, it gave the impression of a wise elder patiently explaining something to a child.
We can feel it when their minds transition, and we can feel it when they leave this plane.
You feel their minds? Even after they're dead?
I didn't have a mind as you know it until the All-Knowing gave me the power to understand language.
How is it possible your species understands these things? Are you telling me you can feel where a consciousness is? How it's present, even if you can't see it? Even if it doesn't have a body?
That's how we can feel human minds. That's how I found you when your starship was crashed.
Could you feel it when the crocodile got Edryk? Could you feel what happened to him?
And I can feel Edryk move to a new realm.
If I asked you to, do you think you could lead us? With the Econoline, do you think you could take us to where he is now?
Maybe, but it is a dangerous place to go.
It can't be any more dangerous than what we're doing right now. But I'm giving serious thought to seeing what would happen if I followed him to where he was going. Is there a way to bring him back? Look, I know it's going to be very dangerous, but will you take me?
Of course I will. I'm always open to adventure! You tell me when and I'll point the way.
Thanks. I'll have to talk to the others.
Now, can someone pass me a comic book?
Swords Against Madness is played, written, and performed by Brian C. Rideout. Editing, mastering, and audio production were from Stormhead Productions. All sound effects are licensed from Pixabay. This episode included the song King Edward by Mr. Smith, a Creative Commons by Attribution song released through the Free Music Archive. It also included Combat, classic metal Chugga Chugga by John Cohen, and several songs by one of my favorite musicians, Alexander Nakarada, including Apex, Scorched Fields, and Crossroads, all released through Pixabay and used in accordance with their license. Also from Pixabay, I've used This Metal by Mr. Claps, Melodic Metal by Alex Koff, Powerful Stylish Rock by Sound For You, Acid Core by Jumping Bunny, and Island of the Lost by Obliques. All of my sound effects are also licensed through Pixabay, and I'd like to make a special shout out to my 3 favorite sound effects designers on the site: Dragon Studio, Free Sound Community, and Floraphonic. These accounts are the source for almost half the sound effects I use in the show, and I want to help them by saying thank you, and keep up the great work. Speaking of thanks, this episode includes the voice talents of Owen Rideout as the Psy Squid. Owen is my son and runs his own podcast about sea life, Boy in the Submarine. And I love hearing from my audience. Consider getting in touch with me. I'm on X at SwordsVMadness, and you can email me through swordsvmadness@stormheadproductions.ca. I'm still accepting questions if anybody wants to contribute to my AMA bonus episode coming up this spring. And until next time, play hard, roll high, and think weird.